Baptist Hill was the first black cemetery in Auburn. The cemetery holds an abundance of historical value, containing over 1,000 marked and unmarked graves. The burial ground allows individuals, families, and communities to give their condolences to those who have already passed. It also gives people an opportunity to honor the people already buried and better educate themselves. Though it may not seem like it, this 4-acre plot of land contains hundreds of stories relating to Auburn's past. The story map allows people to get a better picture of the cemetery. A story map is an immersive story that combines text, video, and maps through GPS coordinates. It can be displayed online and is easily accessible to the public, allowing people to learn about the cemetery and the people therein without disturbing the sacredness of the space itself. Story maps can also be edited and improved as documents are uncovered. Unlike physical markers such as plaques, it is easy to update and maintain the map due to it being online. There are many ways to respect the cemetery. For example, walk between the grave plots and try not to step on the burials. Many burials are unmarked as many were unable to afford a headstone, but many are still visible as depressions in the ground. Don't kick up grass and dirt when walking around. Smoking in the cemetery is also considered disrespectful, as well as leaning and sitting on the headstones. Don't remove objects from graves that are placed by family members. When leaving, clean up after yourself and be careful to leave things better than you found them. A sense of reverence and reflect on the lives of those interred, as the people buried there have experienced racism in many forms, from enslavement to segregation to disproportionate incarceration. Baptist Hill is a community cemetery and a place to show respect for those buried there and their families. Maintaining and treating Baptist Hill with respect and care is everyone's job, and we are all responsible when it comes to maintaining this part of Auburn's history. Unfortunately, there have been many things that have happened that have not respected this space. During the 1940s, German POWs from Camp Opelika were buried in family plots. Also, the expansion of Dean Road caused erosion to the property. The city of Auburn at that time looked to the African American community to pay for a retaining wall. More recently, a neighbor's zip line damaged a marker on the property. Baptist Hill Cemetery is for the community to show respect. It is not a recreational space. Baptist Hill Cemetery is Auburn's first separate black community cemetery, which offers a rich source of the city's black heritage. Much of the history is oral, but it is known that a white man donated most of the land in the early 1870s. This man probably donated the land to create a cemetery. Black persons were buried on the outside of the Pine Hill on the north end. When Hare Avenue was cut and later the apartment buildings were built along the street, many remains were dug up and discarded. Baptist Hill Cemetery acquired its name from the first black congregation in Auburn, Ebenezer Baptist, founded in 1865. Ebenezer Baptist stood at the top of the hill on Thatch Avenue, and the cemetery got its name based on its proximity to the church on the hill. The black church members of Ebenezer Baptist were some of the first to be buried on Baptist Hill. Baptist Hill Cemetery is not as nearly appreciated in the Auburn community as other historic cemeteries. Due to it being a community cemetery, Baptist Hill is not being kept up to the same standard as city-run cemeteries, such as Pine Hill, Memorial Park, and Town Creek. Many families sharing connections to those buried in the cemetery still live in the area, and citizens are responsible for preserving this piece of history and respecting its existence in the community. The cemetery may not have a lot of importance to some, but to families who have ancestors buried here, it is a big deal, and those families should be the ones who decide how Baptist Hill should be preserved. The cemetery is a big part of Auburn's segregated past, and it stands as a reminder for future generations. Many things are being done currently in hopes of preserving this historic location. Descendant families, the Cemetery Association, and the Baptist Hill Remembrance and Historic Initiative hope to keep the burial ground up to an appropriate standard. Two of the most attractive markers in Baptist Hill are those of mother and son Molly Phillips, who lived to be 98 years old, and Ernest Phillips. These are two of the only 3 markers in the cemetery that feature a lamb, commonly used to symbolize the Lamb of God. Molly Phillips lived on Drake Avenue, and her son Ernest was a carpenter who worked for Amos Cox. Molly's daughter, Maddie, married Wes Frazier, a carpenter. The Clarks are a prominent Auburn family for whose Clark Avenue is named. Only 2 graves in the lot are identified, those of George M. Clark, a professional military man, and Willie Mae Clark, his wife. One source says, however, that this one family produced 3 black Masons, one professor, Herbert Clark, who may have been the second black man in Auburn to get his Ph.D., and the first trained nurse in Auburn, Mildred Clark Slaughter.
An outdoor classroom at Baptist Hill Cemetery will help to showcase the Black history of our town, Auburn. It will help to remember Auburn's Black history through informational plaques, a virtual tour of the cemetery, and QR codes. A QR code is a barcode you can scan with your phone's camera to go to a website to find additional information. These devices are not only important in spreading the Black history of Auburn, but also in keeping the history well maintained and respected. By using these means, we can keep people from walking through the cemetery and disrespecting this sacred space or littering in it. For our project, we would need a few things to be done to the property. The City of Auburn already owns this property, and the current plans for it include intersection improvements and a green space. This plan for an outdoor classroom would be a positive additional step. We would need to clear the debris first and then add a covered pavilion for learning on the lot on the corner of Dean and McKinley. Plaques opposite of Dean Road displaying information about people interred in the cemetery, and a concrete path from the sidewalk to the pavilion and other buildings on the property. We would also want buildings with bathrooms and a water fountain for people during summer and a security system for protecting the property from vandalism. The existing plumbing from the house currently on the lot can be used for the bathrooms and water fountains. The old house isn't an essential piece of Auburn, but this cemetery is. We, as a town, need to be more knowledgeable about that history. This outdoor classroom can help with that. This is why it is necessary to build an outdoor classroom on this plot of land. We should have plaques for people that are buried in Baptist Hill Cemetery. These people were generally enslaved people, farmers, businessmen, pastors, teachers, and skilled laborers. For example, Glenn Rudd provided some of the cemetery's land at the north end of the cemetery. He owned 65.5 acres of land just north of the cemetery. It was not very common for black people to own land during this period, and he owned a lot. He was also a carpenter who helped build the Lee County Training School that for the first time allowed for a high school education for African Americans in Auburn. Amos Wynn was enslaved by a young man named Jeff Wynn. When Jeff was killed in a hunting accident, Amos was determined to place a marker on his former enslaver's grave. Amos paid for a stone marker for his enslaver. His devotion to his former enslaver demonstrates the psychological brutality of enslavement, identification with one's captor. On top of the physical brutality he likely endured as a slave. John Reese loaned money to Shel Toomer in order for him to buy into his stepfather's drugstore, now known as Toomer's Drugs. If someone wants to know more about any of these people, they can scan a QR code located at the pavilion. We will have the QR code link to a story map of the cemetery, which has audio and video included to explain the information. The information will be easily understandable, so it can be presented without a teacher present. The type of people who will be able to use this space could be junior high students, Dean Road Elementary students, regular community members, library patrons, university students, or anyone who wants to know more about the cemetery. When it comes to the audience, we need to make sure they know to be quiet, respectful, and calm. Doing this will help to maintain the cemetery and keep it a sacred place for many families.
My favorite part of this project was looking at historical documents such as the census records because I enjoyed being able to look at first-hand pieces of evidence.
Work with my friends and the college students to learn more about Black history and Auburn.
Be inspired by Gatsby Rice because even though she was facing discrimination at the time, she still worked hard to be a successful businesswoman, and that inspires me to be better too.
I enjoyed working with my classmates and talking with Dr. Buck.
I really enjoyed learning about Baptist Hill Cemetery because there's so much history that is unrecognized And through this project, we were really able to try and bring justice and respect to the history that is silenced at Baptist
I
Hill.
enjoyed getting to know my classmates. They're really cool people, and I'm glad I got to work with them, and getting to know them was so much
I
fun.
enjoyed working with others to achieve a bigger goal.
Well, what I like about the project is like I'm doing something meaningful with the project. Usually when I do projects, it's not really it's just work, but this one has meaning and significance for the Black community in Auburn City.
I really liked working with the university people. Our student, Lady Mayfield, was really fun to work with, and it was a really good working environment.
Enjoyed working with my partners and really enjoyed working with Mr. Bob. He's a good person and a good
I really liked
teacher.
learning about a specific person in general that affects us. I mean, usually you just hear stories of these people who faced all these prejudices, and you can't really put a name to a face. But with this, I'm able to learn about who he was. He was a real person who had a real family. And not only that was I able to learn about him, but I was able to create a way I could almost honor him and almost help kind of change my community and show others that we are trying to take a step forward. We are trying to make this world a better place where we can coexist more peacefully.
What I liked about this project was knowing that I helped contributed to the preservation of local African American history and keeping their stories alive and in the general culture.
I enjoyed all the researching aspects because I've always heard stories about like the beginnings of Auburn University, but like all of this stuff I've never heard about, and so getting to like research and finding new things was just a lot of fun and felt almost like a little puzzle that was waiting to be solved.
I like getting to talk to my college student and just overall getting to know my group mates better.
Glenn Rudd was a very generous man, and he deserves to be remembered and celebrated. His contribution of land to Baptist Hill Cemetery was intrinsic and helped many Black families receive the proper burial that they deserved. Glenn was born in Auburn on April 6, 1885. He was born into a family of likely sharecroppers, and they lived in Lee County's 18th precinct. Sharecropping was a system where the landowner would provide the seed and other farming supplies to a poor southerner, usually a former enslaved person, and they would also receive around half of the harvest. Sharecropping was supposed to benefit both the landowner and the sharecropper. But, unfortunately, the system wasn't built to help sharecroppers reach economic freedom. High interest rates and crooked landowners normally left the sharecroppers in enormous debt. It essentially was just another form of servitude. Even though Glenn Rudd was a very hardworking individual, he was unable to read and write as a young man. But, by his mid-20s, he had learned how to both read and write. This is a good indicator of his character and also shows us that he was self-disciplined and dedicated to learning. On October 17, 1907, he married his wife, Rhoda. Rhoda was also an Auburn native. Rhoda worked hard to take care of their home and children. Glenn had a total of 5 kids, 2 daughters and 3 sons. His sons also helped him farm and took after him by also having a knack for agriculture. He also had at least 4 grandchildren. He also was a skilled carpenter and had many other skills which he had acquired through his years of work. He was a founding member and built the pews for Lee Chapel, which is an African Methodist Episcopal church. He also helped build the Lee County Training School, where one of his daughters was part of the first high school graduating class of 1932, which, at this time, was unheard of for a young Black woman in Auburn to graduate from high school. Having a high school to graduate from was very important to the Black community, as white families had had a high school in town for quite a while. Glenn Rudd was a skilled farmer who rented land to get started and later on bought his own land, which was, in itself, a rare achievement for Black families in the 19th century. Glenn Rudd owned 65 acres of land and used a lot of it for farming. And, over time, he eventually sold some of his land to the north end of Baptist Hill Cemetery so people could have more room to bury their loved ones. He did this because Baptist Hill was running out of land mainly due to so many people moving into Auburn, and Rudd wanted there to be a place for the proper burial of Black families in Auburn. He also left some plots for his family because he wanted to guarantee that his children, wife, and grandkids would have a place to be buried. Glenn Rudd and people like him tend to be overlooked by people in society. Society believes that most Black men and women shouldn't be successful, which shouldn't be the case. Rudd's story is significant because he was courageous and worked hard despite the discrimination and the challenges that he faced in his life. He showed his concern for the community by selling land, helping to build and form a church, and by building a school for black children. His story is important to share because he exemplifies the importance of determination and bravery. Rudd died on February 7, 1960. For years following his death, his family paid for many obituaries to be published in the newspaper. This shows how his family believed he was more important than anything in the world. From this, we conclude that he was well respected, a family man, and was very passionate about what he wanted in life. His memory lives on, and his story deserves to be heard.
Good morning. I'm Willie Muse. I was asked to give about a 3-minute block of my experience as a sharecropper on the farm many years ago. As you know, back in the day when we were born, there was only slavery had been over 100 years at that time. But we were sharecroppers. We got caught up in that sharecropping era. And we were, as young people, we were obligated to carry our role in the field at a very early age, whether it was hoeing or picking cotton. And while we were in the field, if we were too young to pick cotton or carry a row, we were water boys. We would carry water to the person, the field hands who worked in the field. It was then later on, when we, as working in the field, that we experienced planes flying overhead, and we learned that those planes were pilots being trained for war far away, which was actually in Europe, and that was World War II. And we learned that that they would buzz us from time to time as we worked in the field. And then one day there was a squadron of planes approaching, and they sort of buzzed us in a sense. And then we, as we looked, they tilted the plane so that we could see in the cockpit. And in the cockpit there were a black man. They called him colored in that day and time. And he waved at us, and others followed suit. And they waved at us, and then they went on out in the field and started doing their maneuvers. And we learned later on, as Mr. X came by, he was a landlord. He came by and he had us to know that they were experimenting with some black folk or colored folk over at Tuskegee Institute to see if they could fly planes. And it so happened that those persons were able to fly planes. They turned out to be the Tuskegee Airmen. In the military, they were the Red Tails who escorted bombers during World War II. And to us, they represented a glimmer of hope for us in the field. For we realized that black people, colored people, could do anything that anybody else could do. That was a glimmer of hope for us, even from Dallas County, Orville, Alabama.
My experiences with the AP students at Auburn High School has been extraordinary. I say with confidence that both groups worked tirelessly on this project. I would never forget the labs as well as the insight I shared with the white group that consisted of Lauren, Emmy, Shayla, and Ryan, as well as the plethora of knowledge I was able to provide the blue group that consisted of Wesley Ann, Johan, Aaron, and Claire. I knew that I possessed a passion for teaching and education, but it was only intensified by working with those diligent and ambitious AP students at Auburn High. Each student possessed an unquenchable thirst for knowledge, which was impressive to me. As we reviewed the life story of Blanche Carter, an activist for housing and equal rights in Auburn, we discovered that there was more to the story than what the eyes can see. Blanche was a caring mother, loving wife, preacher, and teacher of righteousness, and to me, she was one of the frontline foot soldiers in the fight for equality in Auburn. We learned about Carter's experiences with racism and much more. No doubt, some of those experiences were very painful, but she did not let them bring her down. As an African American journalist and storyteller, I took delight in the opportunity to share the story of one of the most remarkable unsung heroes in African American community in Auburn. I felt that it was my obligation to investigate and answer the who, what, when, why, and how as it pertains to the life of Blanche Carter. Under the leadership of Dr. Robert Bub and Miss Caitlin Halperin, this wonderful opportunity was indeed fruitful. The information was provided by Miss Linda Carter, daughter of Blanche Carter, and for that I want to extend a warm and personal thank you. I will cherish the memories and moments from my work with those magnificent AP students at Auburn High School.
Blanche Carter was raised by a hard-working family but led a very difficult life. From a young age and throughout her entire life, Blanche faced discrimination, racism, and segregation. For example, she had trouble getting a good education due to her race, but no matter how disrespectful people were to her, she always treated others with kindness and taught those around her to do the same. After her husband, Dowdell Carter, passed away, she was left to be a single mother of their 6 children. She put aside her dreams of becoming a nurse to provide for her family. She heavily involved herself in the Auburn community and is seen as a strong figure in fighting for equality for all, specifically here in Auburn, with equitable housing. On her headstone, Blanche is remembered as a beloved mother and a cherished grandmother. Blanche Carter was born on May 18, 1927 to her parents, Fala Moore and Warner Spratling. She lived in Waverly, Alabama with them and helped with the farm. Her father was a World War I veteran and her mother sold butter, eggs, milk, and other goods. Her parents worked as sharecroppers, in which the profit was low due to the lack of crop that the sharecropper was able to keep. Sharecropping is when someone rents land from a landowner to farm, and a certain percentage of their crops goes to the owner of the land. Sharecropping is highly similar to slavery because sharecroppers were in debt to the landowners and could not break their contract with them or they would get in jail. In most instances, sharecroppers would be indebted to those landowners for their whole life, just like slaves were owned for their whole lives. Carter began her education in the 6th grade, and then as a teenager she moved to Camp Hill, Alabama, where she went to school in Lafayette and graduated from Lafayette High School. Before Blanche Carter was wed, she moved to Columbus, Georgia, and began working as a dry cleaner. In 1949, she married Dowdell Carter, who she had 3 daughters with, Linda, Beverly, and Shirley. They also had 3 sons, Dowdell Jr., Alfonso, and Dwayne. Dowdell Sr. passed away on June 21, 1967, after years of battling a terminal illness. Following his death, Blanche was given the job of raising her 6 children and providing for her family alone. During this time, she relied on Lee Chapel AME Church for comfort, but she persevered and managed to build a life for her children. After Dowdell Carter's passing, Blanche Carter took the head of the family as a single mother, by getting a job as a servant to a minister's wife. During this job, she experienced the discrimination of her time when she was accused of stealing from the home one day, when she had accidentally just misplaced an item. Blanche Carter was known for standing up for herself, so when the item was found and the lady who had accused her apologized, she still decided to quit and began working for the company Protective Life Insurance, where she collected life insurance premiums and policies. When Blanche was not at work, she was actively engaging in her community's activities, whether it was chaperoning for the community center or teaching the Word of God to the children of the Drake apartment complex. She continued to be engaged by attending local city council meetings and went on to co-found the Auburn Housing Tenant Council. Blanche could not afford to go to school during the day, but that did not stop her, as she was spending her time in night school. Her dream was to become a nurse because she was very passionate for helping those around her. However, she was unable to achieve this due to constraints of time and money. Fortunately, she did lead a life of self-employment by teaching future generations the importance of giving respect and earning an education until her passing in 2000 of renal failure. Blanche Carter inspired those close to her to better themselves and strive for equality in ways such as raising her kids to be respectful and kind to all, as well as her contributions to the housing in Auburn. She was very involved in the City of Auburn's government as she routinely attended city council meetings and worked with housing in Auburn through them. Through her vote on the Tenant Council, she had an important role of representing the Black community on the city decisions regarding houses and taxes. She looked to educate people by teaching the youth in her area. Blanche always valued education and was highly important because she knew how far it could take someone, especially a person of color during the Civil Rights Movement. She always loved to help others in the Auburn community when she was able to. Ultimately, Blanche Carter influenced Auburn history and the history of housing and civil rights in Auburn.
The story of Gatsby Rice is a very inspirational story from our own Lee County that we need to know to understand history. Gatsby Rice was an African American woman who accomplished great things, like owning property, lending money, and running stable businesses. Her parents were both enslaved, and she was born enslaved in New Orleans. She was likely sold apart from her family at the age of 13, and she traveled alone with Alicia Milton to Auburn, Alabama in 1845 to be Alicia's nanny. Because she was enslaved, we do not know her exact birth date or how old she was when she passed, but we do know that she passed around the age of 70 and was born around 1832. As an enslaved person, Gadsby Rice was able to take advantage of the skills she learned during her enslavement, such as sewing and cooking, when she was free from slavery. She went on to use these skills to pursue her own career. Throughout her life, Gadsby Rice ran a boarding house by the modern-day Methodist Church on Magnolia Street for college cadets, and worked as a seamstress and laundress there. She formed many relationships here with the white community in order to keep her business thriving and have enough money to survive. Although respected more than the majority of African Americans in the South, Gadsby Rice still faced discrimination head-on. Additionally, Gadsby Rice was an owner of a millinery shop in Auburn where she sold hats to the white community to earn extra money. Sadly, the millinery shop burned down on January 5, 1892, but the burning of her business did not stop her from continuing to be a hard-working, successful woman. Gadsby Rice was a widowed mother of a son and daughter by the names of Willie and Nancy. Her belongings and her loans throughout her life are evidence that she had a financially stable career. She owned 2 houses in Auburn and a house in Opelika, alongside a 243-acre plot of land near the modern-day Tuskegee area. In modern days, it is estimated that a 243-acre plot of land would be worth about $500,000. She also made a couple of loans in her life, such as a $672 loan to the Carr family for their farm mortgage. At one point, she also loaned $10 to a man by the name of H.K. Quiller. This amount of money was rare and difficult at this time for a black woman to have. This makes us confident that she was a financially well-off and hard-working woman. She also was a very generous woman to loan so much of her money away to help others. With the death of Gadsby Rice, the rumors of her being poorer than she was arose. This shows that during this time period, the South wanted to degrade the success of African Americans to maintain white supremacy. But when you look for the truth, she was actually a prominent, rich black woman. Upon her death, she chose to be buried in the white cemetery, Pine Hill Cemetery, rather than the African American Baptist Hill Cemetery. To this day, Gadsby's grave is the only African American grave in Pine Hill Cemetery to be marked with a headstone. This marker represents not only herself, but the several other enslaved people who were buried near her, some of which were dug up and were thrown away to make a new road. The reason for her wish to be buried in Pine Hill Cemetery is still unknown, though there are multiple speculations, one of which is that her husband was buried there. During this time period, African Americans would often request to be buried in white cemeteries because they had family members who were buried there before a black cemetery was created. Another speculation is that she wanted to be buried along with all the people she worked for, since the majority of them were white. This speculation was made by the white population because they likely wanted to tell a narrative that minimizes the brutality of enslavement and supports an ideology of white supremacy. Although unknown, the first speculation is likely more probable because Gadsby was known as the widow in her community, suggesting a close bond to her spouse. This leads us to believe that Rice would likely want to be buried near her husband who passed away before the establishment of Baptist Hill Cemetery, and therefore was buried in Pine Hill. Several years later, the marker for her grave was bought by a Georgian and former boarder, which stirred up more rumors doubting her wealth. But despite all these rumors and uncertainties, it is clear with a little more research to see that she was a person of importance and good wealth. Gadsby Rice's success of moving from enslavement to a free, successful, working African American woman is an inspiration to all who hear her story. Her story offers a more accurate and nuanced understanding of those who were formerly enslaved. Instead of a narrative that describes Gadsby as only a loyal and compliant slave for choosing to be buried in Pine Hill Cemetery and being poor upon her death, her story may reveal something quite different. Gadsby Rice was an independent African American woman who worked very hard to be successful enough to make her own life decisions.
My name is Reagan Sanders, and I'm a senior at Auburn University majoring in nonprofit studies. And I'm so grateful and so honored that I've been able to be a part of this project. So thankful for the time that I've gotten to spend with these AP US History students at Auburn High. I loved getting to work with them. I loved getting to learn with them and to research with them and to engage in these stories with them. The story that we chose, that our group worked on, was the story of Charles Green Miller, which is one that I was drawn to because although it's fairly well known in the community in Opelika, it's not one that's really been recognized or dealt with, that the weight of it hasn't really been grappled with, the story hasn't really been told in full, especially in a way that honors Charles Green Miller's life. So getting to walk through his life with the students, getting to do lots of really careful research, asking lots of questions, was really an experience that I'm incredibly grateful for. And they managed it and walked through it so well. Because honestly, this is a really difficult story and in a lot of ways a pretty complicated and painful story. And it's a story that includes a lot of questions. It doesn't all tie up really neatly. There's a lot that we don't know, and there's a lot that's really tragic and really painful, and these students carried that with such grace and with such responsibility to take on something that is so important and that matters so much, and I'm so proud of all the work that they've done and all the effort and time and dedication that they have poured into making sure that Charles Miller's story gets told and that his life is honored.
In Opelika in 1932, an African-American man named Charles Miller was accused of a crime, hunted down by a mob, and was killed before being displayed in front of the courthouse, the place where he should have had a fair trial. If a scenario similar to this occurred in today's time, what would the world say? Would this demonstration of power and racism be looked down upon in our present society, or would it be shrugged off like it was so many years ago? The modern-day stories of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor illustrate that this kind of violence is not relegated to the past. Therefore, Charles Miller's story holds even more importance and implications for our day and age. Charles Miller was a man raised modest and hardworking. He grew up as a sharecropper in Opelika. Sharecropping was a legal arrangement in which landowners allowed tenants to rent land in return for a share of the crops produced on said land. The sharecropper rented equipment, seed, and housing from his boss, and thus stayed in perpetual debt, no matter how successful his harvest. It was a kind of slavery, just a debt enslavement instead of chattel enslavement. Miller was a railroad worker. His wife Rosa worked as a cook. Miller also had a brother and sister-in-law who would later come into play in many versions of Miller's story. A good man is how the sheriff described Miller leading up to the incident. In the aftermath of Miller's lynching, it was reported that his wife Rosa had died from a slit throat. It was suspected that Miller had done this, though there was no investigation, and by that time Miller had been lynched, so there was no way for him to defend himself in court. However, before the lynching, he went to his brother-in-law's, Taylor Matthews' house and fired a shot into the wash basin, with some of the buckshot lodging in his brother and sister-in-law's hands. The intent was likely to intimidate because he never shot at them directly. Sheriff William Buck Jones was called to respond to the incident, and Taylor Matthews then decided to visit Charles Miller's homes. Before leaving, the sheriff stated, "I know this fellow. He is a good fellow. He won't give me any trouble." Upon arriving to Miller's home, he opened the screen door and was shot in the chest by Miller with a single-barrel shotgun. When Miller saw that it was the sheriff, he exclaimed, "Oh, Mr. Buck, I didn't know it was you," and fled his house out the back door. Newspapers reported on the incident with a variety of viewpoints, dates, and even how the entire case went down. Even with range of speculation, it is still clear to see that what happened to Mr. Charles Miller was not morally correct in the slightest. To be brutally murdered, then displayed in front of the place where your verdict should be determined by a jury of your peers, is a large slap in the face to his family as well as the African American community. According to newspapers, it only took a few hours for a posse of officers and citizens to form to hunt Miller down. However, depending on which source you read, the size of the posse varies from 20 to around 100 plus people. The variety of information presented in these articles is very over-exaggerated in an attempt to vilify Charles Miller and make the lynching seem justified to the public. One attempt at this was a report of Miller being under the influence of alcohol. Another way that they did this was reporting that he had fired into the mob, while others say he had not. Even the number of times that he was shot by the mob varied depending on where you read it, the amount of time being anywhere between 50 to 160 shots. Because of the obvious racial bias against black people down south, the newspapers were quick to turn it around and vilify the victims of these lynchings to make it seem like it was something that needed to be done, when obviously that logic is horrendously racist and disgusting. This was an unjustified act, since Charles Miller was disregarded of his rights and not offered a fair trial in court to testify and defend himself as to whether he was guilty or innocent of what many had accused him. This lynching was intended to scare African American members of Opelika and set an example for what would happen to them if they upset the social order established by the white community. Nearly after 100 years after Charles Miller's death, similar instances of murder and unjustified violence against black people still occur. It is important to acknowledge the injustice done to Charles Miller, just as it is important to recognize and grieve the injustice committed in our day. Charles Miller was a victim of many injustices. He was not given a fair trial, and he was a symbol of racist hate and Southern discrimination of African Americans. The purpose of this video is to commemorate Charles Miller's whole life, all 13,860 days, and not that final day for which he was condemned, as a part of Lee County's history, a past that should never be repeated.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ashley Brown, and I, along with Olivia Nichols, are the co-founders of the Lee County Remembrance Project. We have a partnership with Equal Justice Initiative that allows for us to shine a light on the racial injustices experienced by John Moss, George Hart, Charles Humphreys, and Samuel Harris.
Thank you for telling these stories and for raising awareness of these buried truths here in Lee County. By telling these stories, you are confronting the reality of our past and shining a light on the legacies which have stemmed from it. Truth-telling is brave, important work, and absolutely necessary to truly reconcile the racial violence and injustice that has occurred here and around the nation.
Please continue to be a beacon of light and inspiration. Mahatma Gandhi says it best: be the change you wish to see in the world. And you all are doing just that.
John Moss, George Hart, Charles Humphreys, Samuel Harris, and Charles Miller. 5 lynchings occurred in the Lee County area between 1886 and 1932. Lynching is defined as the extrajudicial mob killing of an individual, especially a black individual, for a real or perceived crime without trial. In Lee County, 5 people are known to have been lynched. Between 1882 and 1968, 4,743 people were lynched in the United States. This memorial is proposed to bring justice to and memorialize the victims of lynching in Lee County. In 1886, John Moss and George Hart were working on the Waldrop family property when Edmund Waldrop Jr. went missing. John Moss, while helping with the search, found Waldrop's body, and both he and Hart were accused of murder. Both men fled. Moss was found in Wetumpka and then brought to Waverly. That evening, November 3rd, he was hung at the Cannon Church. Hart was found while he was fleeing Birmingham and was taken to jail 20 days later. When the public found out, another white mob brought him to the same church and lynched him on November 5, 1887. On March 18, 1900, Charles Humphreys was accused of sneaking into the room of a white girl. The next morning, the white girl's father led a mob to Humphreys' house. They proceeded to shoot him 40 times. On November 3, 1900, the Meadows family was attacked in their home. Samuel Harris was accused because he had soot on his hands and face, and his fingerprints appeared to be matched with fingerprints found on the crime scene. A mob of 125 white men brought Harris to Catherine Meadows. After she claimed he was the man who attacked them, the mob tortured and shot Harris. Harris's family was accused of being accomplices without evidence. The last lynching in the Lee County area took place in 1932 during the Depression. On June 29, 1932, Charles Green Miller uncharacteristically went to his brother-in-law's home and shot a single round into the washtub that injured the hand of his in-laws. Later, Sheriff Buck Jones came to check on Miller at his home. Miller shot Sheriff Jones after Jones opened the door to Miller's home. Miller then fled from his house. After getting wind of what happened, a white mob hunted Miller down. 2 hours later, Miller was found. The white mob then shot Miller 50 to 150 times. His body was then put on display on the courthouse lawn. No one was charged for any of the lynchings in the Lee County area. The proposed memorial will be outdoors, in the empty lot next to the Charles Miller House. There will be 5 blue Bahia granite obelisks arranged in a semicircle, each representing a victim of lynching. The blue of the granite represents justice. The semicircle was chosen to represent openness and community. Each obelisk will be inscribed with the name and story of a victim. In the center of the semicircle, there will be a plaque that will include the definition and explanation of lynching. There will be a riverstone path from the plaque to each obelisk. The pathways are necessary to move around the center in an orderly fashion and to prevent destruction of the property. The riverstone is representing how the Black community has continued to evolve despite the hardships they have been facing. In between the obelisks, there will be flower beds filled with cornflowers and black-eyed Susans to represent justice. There will also be wooden benches for people to sit and reflect. The choice of oak wood for the wooden benches was chosen to represent the strength of these individuals. This Justice Center could possibly be funded by donations, fundraisers, appealing to the Parks and Recreation, or community relations departments of the Opelika city government to see if they could fund it using tax money, and applying for any equal justice grants. The legacy of racism continues today, as do extrajudicial killings of Black individuals over perceived crimes. In February of 2020, Ahmaud Arbery was shot and killed while jogging through a neighborhood. The justification given was that he looked like a burglar. In the summer of 2020, Black Lives Matter protests were sparked after George Floyd, a Black man, was killed by police after being accused of forging a $20 bill. The case of Charles Miller bears striking similarity to the case of Breonna Taylor. Plainclothes police entered her home without announcing themselves as police and shot her after her boyfriend brought out a gun, assuming their home was being broken into. Though great strides have been made, racial justice in America has not yet been realized. Memorializing our history serves as a reminder of how far we have come and how far we have left to go. The 5 lynchings in Lee County and the thousands of lynchings in the U.S. as a whole was a precursor for what was to come in the future. Despite previous lynchings, the U.S. is still adapting to the racial injustice that was frequent in their past, and lynchings of the past can often be connected or share similarities to protests and police brutality that are present today. The proposed memorial will bring awareness to these subjects of lynchings and how they connect to racial social issues of today, and bring justice to and memorialize the victims of lynchings.
Hello everyone, my name is Barbara Giddens Bethany. My father, George Giddens Jr., was George Sr. and Addie Giddens' youngest son. This is a great honor for my grandparents in recognition of their contribution to the community over a century ago. To be able to provide a resting place for African Americans whose families could not afford to bury them was indeed an act of unselfishness, kindness, generosity, and love, straight from the heart. This occurred during a time in history when African Americans were suppressed by slavery and education was not a priority. Most could not read or write, but my grandfather was an exception. He strived for success, and he succeeded. He became a businessman in his own rights. Growing up, the older grandchildren who knew my grandparents would joke about him being tight with money, but in a good way. I was too young at the time to understand fully what they meant, but because of your research, I now know. I call that good money management and time well spent. He had a dream to provide a better life for his wife and 5 children. He was able to start investing in land and real estate properties in 1901 at the early age of around 28. The cemetery was part of his first investment. After my grandparents' death, his children maintained and continued his legacy. I am so thankful to all of you and the research group for bringing their story to life. It means so much to me to learn where my humble beginnings started. My father and his siblings were all wonderful, caring people. Because of my grandparents, we all lived a comfortable life, and I was able to get a college degree. Your research and essays have been above excellent. I know my grandparents are watching with a big smile on their face, full of love, gratitude, and thanks. I'm so proud to be their granddaughter. Remember, in spite of all the odds stacked against them, they prove that there is always a bright light of success. You have to believe in it, reach for it, set your goals, and stay focused. Thanks again, and best wishes to all of you. Goodbye.
The Giddens family were and still are important for many reasons. They represented the best of an African American family in the 20th century, and they were a family of farmers that lived on their property that they owned for generations. Because George was formerly enslaved, he saw the importance of supporting those less fortunate and allowed people such as Viola Johnson and her mother Gloriana Hardy to be buried on his property where they otherwise had no place in the city cemetery. This can also be seen with the number of field stones found at the back of their property. In 1901, George and Addie Giddens purchased 104.5 acres of land in Opelika. They worked to make something out of the land, leading them to start a farm. In total on that farm, they raised 5 kids, 2 boys and 3 girls, who would go on to inherit the land and continue the farm. Overall, they were very successful for landowners and farmers. That land that George and Addie Giddens lived on is currently located on Frederick Road just outside of Tigertown. As the property currently stands, nature has had its way over the years, causing it to look overgrown. If cleared out, this would make for a great memorial and communal space to honor George and Addie Giddens, the many others that are buried there, and the accomplishments of the African American community living in the Auburn-Opelika area. For starters, some of the weeds and bush would have to be cleared out to create an entrance into the property. Near that entrance, an outdoor classroom like the ones at the Kruger Preserve and Nature Center would contain plaques of information on the Giddens for people who were curious about their lives. This amphitheater-style classroom would have an awning over the tiered seats to protect against the weather. Further in, the area between the Giddens house and the Fieldstones would be cleaned up to put in a community-run garden. A third party, such as a local church or cemetery organization, would rent out spaces to members in the community for them to grow crops and flowers, using the money to fund the upkeep of the memorial space. A community garden would honor the work they did as farmers. In the center of the garden, reflection benches would be placed around a decorative water fountain with plaques that would describe the people buried on the property, along with more information about the Giddens. At the fieldstones and depressions at the end of the property, they would be blocked off by birchwood fences to keep people from wandering into the grave sites. Around the property, people could come across a number of plaques. These plaques would tell the reader various facts ranging from the people buried on the property to specific information about George and Addie Giddens. Overall, this memorial serves to commemorate the Giddens family and their accomplishments. Every aspect of the park would be designed to exemplify this. For instance, that birchwood mentioned earlier in the fences represents the redemption of the Giddens as they worked hard to make something out of their land. This proposed memorial park is important for the Lee County community to keep their stories as well as the stories of those buried on their property in memory.
My name is Jada Ashford, and I am a senior majoring in biomedical sciences from Birmingham, Alabama. And my project is on the untold story of Robert Frazier. And I mainly chose this story because I am a former athlete myself and a big sports fan, and I wanted to learn more about Robert Frazier and his background and his contributions to the university. Working with the high school students has been a great opportunity for me, just getting to know them and teaching them about historical documentation, and they have been a joy to work with, very enthusiastic, wanting to learn more. And this class is a great addition to the Auburn University, and I think it's going to be around for a while. And learning about the untold contributions of African Americans in Auburn University. And through this class, I've also been able to learn more about my family history in itself. So I look forward to the students' presentations in this class going forward.
This is the biography of Robert Frazier, who was known as Auburn's first mascot, but whose life story reveals he was so much more to the Auburn community. Robert Frazier was born on April 10, 1873, to a working family in Auburn, Alabama. His father, William Frazier, was a farmer, and his mother, Dorothy, was a maid. Robert was an athlete during his younger years, but couldn't go any further because there were no opportunities for African Americans to compete on a high school or college level due to radical inequalities in Auburn. He would go on to marry Dorothy Hall and had 10 children, which would become taxing on the family financially. He made sure that he owned his home and had a large house on Glen Avenue. Despite Auburn not having any formal African American high schools until 1928, his family was educated to some capacity, and they were all able to read and write. Robert worked many service jobs to afford his family's expenses, and all of his children worked as well. Having multiple jobs was common for African Americans because the job opportunities during this time didn't pay well. Each job generally paid $5 to $10 a week. Auburn University at the time was the biggest employer for African Americans, but they were limited to service jobs similar to the work of enslaved laborers. Robert would end up having multiple jobs, but his most consistent would be with Auburn University, where he would work in multiple aspects. Robert's various jobs outside of the university included butcher and farmer. He worked for Auburn's athletic department from 1892 until his sickness in 1921. In the athletic department, he was an athletic trainer for 30 years, an equipment handler, a scout, a sponsor for the athletic teams, and a mud boy. He was also used as a mascot in Auburn's first football game in 1892 against Georgia, and this game was also where the first term of War Eagle came from. Auburn students and working force referred to him and other African Americans working in the university in a condescending way. He wasn't respected because they only knew him by his many nicknames, like Bob, Sponsor, Preacher, and Dabble. They didn't get to know his real name. He was well liked in terms of amusement, or seen as a character of the college. At the end of Auburn's 1920 football season, Robert Frazier got very sick. He was taken care of with widely known doctors in Atlanta. Of course, the student body of Auburn didn't want their beloved sponsor to die, so they raised enough money to send him to Atlanta, Georgia, and then Mobile, Alabama. There, Dr. John O. Rush treated him and realized Robert was in critical condition. Robert died on June 19, 1921, and was buried in Baptist Hill Cemetery, Auburn's first separate black cemetery. The engravings on his headstone were provided by his membership in the Mosaic Templars of America, the large African American fraternity that provided death and burial insurance during the Jim Crow era. Robert was well known by athletic directors at Southern colleges, and most of the Auburn students, both white and black, for the last 30 years have called Robert Frazier their friends, not just as entertainment. However, he was also called many derogatory terms that have ties back to antebellum enslavement. Auburn most likely doesn't mention his history because it would imply Auburn was racist. His story and contribution to Auburn University was big, but unrecognized. He paved the way for people like James Owens, the first African football player, Henry Harris, the first African basketball player, and Thomas Gosselin, the first African American athlete to graduate at Auburn University.
Hi, my name is Emily McElhaney. I'm a senior at Auburn University, majoring in Human Development and Family Sciences and minoring in Psychology. I had the privilege of being able to mentor some amazing AP US History students from Auburn High School as we planned a centennial event for Robert Frazier. I chose to help them plan this event because once I heard who Robert Frazier was, I decided he needed an event that was as uplifting and inspirational as he was. I hope you enjoy the presentation that the students worked so hard on.
Robert Frazier Centennial Event. Robert Frazier was Auburn University's first unofficial mascot for the football team for about 30 years. In fact, he was first photographed with the football team in 1892. He also served as a sponsor for all of Auburn's athletic teams, including football, baseball, basketball, and men's track. Frazier took on these jobs and that of a butcher and sharecropper to support his family. He was a family man, taking on these several jobs to support his 10 kids. After his death in 1921, people realized his importance and referred to him as more than just a mascot. Just because he was thought of as a friend does not mean he was treated with respect he deserved due to the racial climate of his time. According to a newspaper article, he was known by most of the athletic directors at Southern colleges, and most of the Auburn students for the last 25 years have regarded Bob as their friend. He has been since rendered first aid treatment to the Auburn team in many a herd battle and will be greatly missed when the football season opens again next fall. While this may be so, Frazier was not well respected as a person, as in that time a mascot's purpose was to be mocked and ridiculed. This mocking and ridicule mostly came from opposing fans. Frazier passed away on June 19, 1921, which happens to be on Juneteenth, the anniversary of the 1865 announcement by the Union Army's General Gordon Granger that proclaimed freedom from slavery in Texas. The next generation should learn from our past mistakes while keeping history and Robert Frazier's story alive, also still working on equality issues that are presented today. His death on this important day in history represents how, although slavery did end in the U.S. before Robert Frazier was born, it was only one step towards equality since segregation and discrimination continued. As a society, we are still working towards this today. Even though slavery is a thing of the past for the United States, its lasting impact and racial inequality continue today, which is why we need to remember the history. We want to keep his story alive by celebrating his life by hosting a community event on the 100th anniversary of his death, which is also Juneteenth. The Celebrating the Life of Robert Frazier event will be open to the community, his descendants, and the current Auburn Athletic Department. The event will begin with a brief biography about Robert Frazier's life, then go into his work for the athletic department, including his time as a mascot. For example, we could talk about how his employment at the university supported his family even though being a mascot meant humiliation. Gus Malzahn, Bruce Pearl, and or the current Auburn athletic director Alan Greene, along with a descendant of Frazier, could speak at the Celebrating the Life of Robert Frazier event. To commemorate this wonderful man's life, we hope to present a plaque memorial where he spent a lot of his time, the first ever football field. This field was behind Sanford Hall. Following the brief biography presentation, there would be a much smaller gathering for his descendants to view the unveiling of the plaque memorial privately. We believe that this remarkable man who has done so much to help Auburn history/football, even though his efforts were not recognized while he was alive, deserves a repaired headstone that symbolizes his importance. Robert Frazier wished to be buried in Auburn, but it's likely that he did not imagine that his final resting place would look like this. You could not even tell that this is Robert Frazier's grave because the headstone is so difficult to read. People should know about Robert Frazier and his story. There should be a place for not only the community to remember him, but also his family. When his family visits his grave, they would see its unkept state. Ideally, it should be in better condition. We would also add a plaque behind Sanford Hall on the 50-yard line of Auburn's former football stadium that describes Frazier's contributions to Auburn athletics. Robert's final resting place is at Baptist Hill Cemetery, which is exactly where he wished to be buried and where he should stay, which is why a statue in the nearby outdoor classroom may be something that Robert would have enjoyed. It, in fact, isn't, so my groupmates and I wanted to introduce the idea of a memorial on campus for all of town to learn about. Many people don't know about the history of Auburn's first unofficial mascot when they need to, as it shows that we can learn from the past and honor those who fought for racial equality. Usually when you think of a mascot, you think of something or someone that proudly represents a team or university. However, Robert Frazier faced the reality that he wouldn't be treated as an equal, but stood by his teammates' sides throughout all of his hardships. He was compared to other offensive mascots, such as George's goat, which represented the way that Auburn thought of him as an amusement and unequal. He suffered this discrimination and cruel treatment to be able to support his family. Even after all this hard work, Robert Frazier fell ill in Auburn and had to be transported to the hospital in Atlanta, where he would unfortunately pass away. Frazier wanted to come home to Auburn to die, which showed his connection not only to Auburn but to his family. After his death, everyone said that they regarded to him as their friend, who they felt close and reliant on. His life was spent in inequality, but in death, those who treated him such a way turned from that attitude and now mourned his life. It leads you to wonder if he was ever in fact their friend. Why did they treat Robert Frazier the way that they did? We believe that creating an area to commemorate Robert's life at the proposed outdoor classroom and a plaque on Auburn's campus would allow those who don't know Auburn's history to learn about it and understand just where we came from and how we can change racial inequality in today's society. A restoration of Robert Frazier's grave is appropriate because we appreciate the sacrifices he made and understand he needs a better kept resting ground.
Through this project, I learned that there was a lot more Black history in Auburn than I realized, and through this outdoor classroom assignment, I can spread it to more people.
I learned more about the Black community in our local area and rewriting the false white savior narrative that Black success is only due to the kindness of white.
I learned that there are not many records about Baptist Hill and other Black landmarks from this time period due to racism and segregation. So while Baptist Hill Cemetery has approximately 400 graves, around 100 of them are unmarked. And so the preservation of Baptist Hill is the preservation of the unrecorded mystery of its history.
A lot about the historical significance of the Black history in Baptist Hill Cemetery, and now whenever I drive by it, I can think about all the stuff that I learned.
I learned more about the experiences of African Americans in Lee County.
I learned about the social aspect of Black history in Auburn, specifically about like housing and like raising children and sports and the community.
I learned that while we can ignore the past and kind of ignore what happens in our society, well, our cities and area, where it's better to kind of embrace it and be more open to discussion about it.
I learned about Robert Frazier's life and his legacy in the university.
Well, with this project, I'm still kind of learning about Auburn's history, and because of this, I was able to learn about some of the parts of it that we may not like to talk about, but it's helped me put a name and a face and a background and a story with all these ideas that we hear of discrimination. It helped me truly see that these are real people, real things happen to this, and it's helped me understand that Auburn is changing, and it's changing for the better, but changes still can be made, and are still needing to be made to this day.
What I learned from this project was the amount of thought and planning that goes into making a public space, such as the one that we are planning to make for the Giddens Memorial.
Well, not only did I learn like the researching aspect, especially for like more historical things that it's a lot harder to find information for, but I also just learned a lot about Auburn University and how it began and like the origins of its mascot, not just from like the stories that we hear when we're like younger, but more like the older things that are more put away in history.
About Auburn's first mascot, which was Robert Frazier, and I learned about his many contributions to Auburn's community that many people don't know about.